hosted by NCBA Clusa, which is the National Co-op Business Association. She went along and she said some really lovely things about the UK co-op movement. Along the way, she made great friends with Doug O'Brien, who we'll be hearing from tomorrow, and Stephen McDow, who we'll be hearing from in a second. Stephen now works for the Keystone Development Centre, and he's dedicated his life to bringing together rural and urban America to help achieve an inclusive economy for all, and primarily working through membership. Just like in the UK, the US is facing some seriously challenging retail conditions. Some are similar, some are different. But like here, it's cooperatives that are uniquely positioned to use their cooperative difference to address some of these challenges. So if you join me in welcoming Stephen.
Thank you. And before I get started, I just want to first thank my wife for putting up with me for 15 years. I also, Rebecca, she's in the corner. I also want to thank Doug O'Brien. Without Doug, this wouldn't have happened. And he saw in me just the spirit of cooperation. And I've learned a lot under his leadership and continue to learn, even today, though I'm with Keystone Development Center. I also want to thank Ed, John, Leonie, and the entire team here in the UK, and of course, Elaine Dean. When we first met, it was like love at first sight in the most appropriate way. And I'm absolutely delighted to be here and to actually talk about some of the trends and what's happening in America in the cooperative movement. When I first started with NCBA Clusa, Doug O'Brien was then our executive vice president, and he had me call and reach out to grocery co-ops throughout the country. I started learning some interesting things about differentiation and pressures in the marketplace from like Amazon's, from Whole Foods. And individuals were absolutely appalled and wondering like, well, what are we going to do? So I had planned originally to actually go down that road. But then I started researching and I learned something that's even more sinister. And I don't mean to be so dramatic about it, but I learned that there are predatory grocery stores currently targeting rural whites and African American and Latinos in America. It's alarming to me what I was learning. They're American dollar stores. Those are the predators. And I really want, excuse me for reading this slide, but I really want you guys to really understand, American dollar stores have grown 50% over the last 8 years. This year alone, they're planning to grow to 50,000 stores. $18 billion in sales, more than Whole Foods, and they have more stores, physical locations, than Walmart and McDonald's combined. But that's not even the most alarming part. The most alarming part to me is they don't even serve fresh produce. Less than 1% of their stores actually grow or have fresh produce. Now, considering the American Academy of Pediatrics put out numerous reports about type 2 diabetes in the country, this is absolutely alarming that we can allow something like this in our wonderful free market enterprise to actually, or a system to actually happen. And they're bold about it. Let's read here in plain sight. Essentially what the dollar stores are betting on in a large way is that we are going to have a permanent underclass in America. That's real estate analyst Garrett Brown told Bloomberg in 2017. Boldly, also in our face, Dollar General CEO, Todd Bezos, he told the Wall Street Journal, the economy is continuing to create more of our core customers. In other words, the more lower income Americans struggle, the better dollar stores do. I was absolutely appalled by this because, of course, being a cooperator and loving everything that we're talking about, our principles, and then also the Rockefeller Foundation's inclusive economy, this is absolutely alarming to me that we would allow something like this to happen. So we absolutely need to address this situation. But before we go down that road, I do have some solutions. I wanted to back up because this is the retail conference, and I wanted to actually talk about just some of the nuts and bolts of what's happening in the grocery sector. And I should also say that I called numerous institutions in our country, and the University of Wisconsin Center of Cooperatives, what one of their representatives told me is, Stephen, you're hitting on something. Aggregate data in our country is something that's hard, that we're talking about doing, but it's hard to come by, and especially when it came to the grocery sector. But so what I went back is I took actually a lead from Doug O'Brien, who targeted or decided to look at the Co-op 100 in one of his presentations. So I went back and I said, well, let's look at that. Let's look at what's happening in the grocery sector in the Co-op 100. These are the 100 largest cooperatives in the country. It's produced by National Co-op Bank. So 7 of the grocery co-ops account for 13% or $28.6 billion in revenue in the United States. Total, amongst all in the Co-op 100, 214 billion, not anything to sort of sneeze at. I went further and I contacted National Co-op Grocers. They had some 2018 numbers, and then one of their representatives got back in touch with me and said they actually represent 145 co-ops operating in over 211 stores in 37 states. They have annual sales of $2.2 billion and a total of 1.3 million owners. Also contacted Stuart Reed, who's the Executive Vice President of the Food Co-op Initiative. They focus on startups. This was some interesting data. 152 grocery co-ops they've actually started. 102, or 67%, are still open. Annual sales, 180 million, and also they have about 160,000. Stuart also went on to actually tell me that the Food Co-op Initiative has had, over the years, since 2006, 50 of their cooperatives close, and the open co-ops, among the open co-ops, they're open an average of about 3 years. Of the closed co-ops, my apologies, they're open an average of 3 years, and the open co-ops average of 6.4 years and rising. So I thought those were interesting numbers to present to you so that you can get an idea and a flavor and a sense of what's happening in the U.S. co-op market. I also drilled down even further. I didn't talk much about my organization that I work for at Keystone Development Center, but let me also say that for the last 20 years, Keystone has provided technical assistance to co-ops in the Mid-Atlantic region, everything from agriculture all the way over to urban. I went back, we have a fabulous map of all the co-ops in the Mid-Atlantic region. Well, growing number of co-ops in the Mid-Atlantic region, because it's not perfect. And of that, I identified 48 grocery co-ops with an aggregate sales of $150 million, which is pretty impressive for that region. Now, those numbers do not include the state of West Virginia or the state of Virginia, which we're trying to obtain funding to actually uncover those as well. I understand by talking to, I believe, Elaine and John, that you guys have one central sort of distribution center for groceries in the United Kingdom. In America, what I learned, of course, there's the U.S. grocery co-ops. They purchase from UNFI, many of them do, as though it's not a company, it is publicly traded. And then there are smaller players in the marketplace, which I thought was really interesting. Like the merchant distributors, MDI, they primarily service the South, the American South. So, talking about key challenges, you can't really talk about key challenges in sort of the grocery sector, what I've been learning from talking to people on the producer side and also folks that are in the grocery co-op side, without looking at agricultural challenges as well, because they do have some bearing on what's happening in the grocery store. So I decided to put those challenges up here. Consistent and fair inspections. Doug and I were talking about that because Doug used to work for the USDA, he's undersecretary. He's like, you're telling me all this stuff I already know. And it was amazing, because what I'm learning when I was speaking to some of the farmers on the producer side is that what they really hope for is that there's a greater understanding in the entire supply chain of what they have to go through and what they're dealing with, and they're hoping that inspectors actually understand their life. They gave an example to me that once there was a farmer, he ran a slaughterhouse, and he had cattle, and what he did is the inspector for years always thought he ran an incredible operation. There was a new inspector that came along with a different set of values, or ideas and actually stop their entire operation, which really almost hurt their business. So I wanted to talk about that because mainly I wanted to focus on wholesale versus direct, because some of what I learned in talking to some of the farmers is that for them, they say, listen, it's a challenge sometimes to sell into co-ops, and sometimes it's easier for them to sell direct, or they'll make more money because they're worried about waste and volume. Another challenge on their side, of course, is marketing and branding. Is really, marketing themselves. They don't really do a good job at that. And then on the grocery side, pressures from big corporations. We talked a little bit about that. Marketplace differentiation, farm to table. Really, it's the farm to table campaign. What I'm learning is that small farmers are finding it really hard to keep up with the demand on the grocery side with the farm to table campaign. So that everyone, they don't know what to do. So they're working extra hard for less money to try to keep up with the actual demand in the grocery space. Food insecurity, that was talked a lot at the Impact Conference in 2018. Urban Crowd, who's on the board of NCBA CLUSA, I went back and looked at his presentation. And many other presentations, they're all really talking about food insecurity and how to address those needs. Cultural bias. Now, cultural bias, absolutely. When it comes to African American and other persons of color, there's always a challenge. But what I also learned at one sustainable agricultural conference, that there's also cultural bias in sort of among the farmers. People look at them as being less educated. One farmer who's 30 years old, she happened to be a female, she actually told me, she said, my parents are both agricultural scientists. And they actually asked me, why do I want to be a farmer? Because that's for other people to do, not for people like you. So, so as all of this started to come home for me, is I started thinking about how, because of many of the challenges kind of overlap and all intertwine and all relate, how do we continue to improve the lives of farmers and also understanding for the entire supply chain? And what I came up with is how do we educate the next generation of workers to understand the farm to table supply chain through the cooperative advantage and through the cooperative principles. And every time I've had this conversation, I've talked to everyone from the producer side and folks in the grocery sector. They're like, this is absolutely fantastic. We have to do it. The agricultural leadership training used to be large in the state of Pennsylvania, for example. In fact, the whole region they serviced, it was called the Pennsylvania Council of Cooperatives. And they used to train individuals in ag science, and they understood the entire supply chain, even how it got to your table. Individuals to this day, like Russ Redding, who's in government, he understands and he equates a lot of what he learned from being a part of that leadership training. So before I even go further, how do grocery co-ops sort of play in this whole ecosystem? And I wanted to take two examples. The first was Weaver's Way Cooperative in Philadelphia, in the state of Pennsylvania. And the second one was Renaissance Community Co-op in Greensboro, North Carolina. Weaver's Way, for example, they're still open. They're highly successful. If you see, they've grown like 300% in 12 years, and they have 9,000 members, 3 locations, a farmer's market, a youth education program. They have 150 employees, 5.9 million in payroll, 600 jobs created, and 9,700 jobs saved when you look at the distribution and everyone that's impacted within the ecosystem. So it remains open. And how were they able to be successful? So when I spoke with their assistant manager, one way is that they felt like they had a great relationship in the K-12 arena. They have relationships with elementary schools and middle schools. They also are not afraid to innovate. So what they did was they hired Instacart. And I don't know if you guys have ever heard of Instacart, but they are a delivery service. And when they started delivering groceries as a cooperative, they saw an increase in members and also engagement. Now, let's talk about the Renaissance Community Co-op. A co-op primarily in a community of color in the South. It was a community that mobilized to fight a trash dump or an incinerator reopening in their community. When they gained all this cultural capital and all this community capital, they said, well, what do we do with this? So they opened up a co-op. So they raised 2.45 million of the 2.8 million that they needed, and over a course of like 21 months, as you see, they grew. They started out with 88 members, and they grew to 728. They created 28 jobs. They projected that they would create 300,000 in community wealth. Now they're selling off their entire operation after 2 years. Well, then I started wondering, well, why is that? How can Weaver's Way be so successful? Though it is a different, sort of slightly different demographic. It's more mixed and professional and working class, and not Renaissance. Well, the main thing that I learned speaking to cooperators and from around the country was that changing buying habits was thought to be one of the biggest hurdles. How do you change individuals who are used to going to like Walmart, maybe the dollar store, maybe their corner market, and how do you get them to understand the cooperative advantage? So then I started thinking, I said, well, what is the solution to all of this? So I touched on it in the beginning when I talked about predatory groceries. How do we educate the marketplace? Well, when I grew up, we always used young people, children. I don't know if you guys have this, but when I grew up, they had something called Vacation Bible School. So we attracted kids from the community, and mainly an African American community from all stratas of life, who came, and when their attitudes started to change, they started to get excited about just being a young person and learning, the parents would then come. So I said, well, let's do the same philosophy in the co-op movement. Let's educate young people, let's do it at scale, because I definitely looked and saw that they're like Co-Fed, the Farmers Union, they all have fabulous pedagogy already developed, and it's already there. So you're not reinventing the wheel. So how do we do this and impact pre-college preparatory, technical, and vocational students on those tracks? Because that's important. When I talk to farmers, they're not really necessarily, well, so one of the farmers said to me, listen, we don't find any value to going to college. I don't know if this is true across the board, but just what I found in the conferences and the farmers that I've spoken to, what they found valuable were apprenticeships. So how do we develop an educational program that's publicly funded, that's at scale, that educates young people K to 12, let's give them jobs, give them vocational training, maybe they'll be long-lasting careers, or maybe they'll use that to help subsidize their university training. There are a lot of options, a lot of creative ways to actually do this. And I thought, with the fact that we had dollar stores, and with the fact that food insecurity and inequality is continuing to grow, with the fact that cultural bias, at least in America right now, seems to be, or at least racial hostility, at an all-time high, at least in my lifetime, and I'm only 42. So how do we do this? We do it by doing that, by creating a publicly funded education curriculum. Now, people say, well, I talked to one person, they said, well, how do you fund that, Stephen? Well, that's very important. And I think there's multiple ways. When I was in education publishing, I learned something called supplemental curriculum. So educators have a certain set of income that they're allowed to use to purchase supplemental curriculum, whether it's in special needs, and assuming that a lot of a subset of individuals in these targets in rural and urban America will have what they call an individual learning plan. It's big. They throw out IEPs like Tic Tacs or candy, sometimes in America. So a subset of that, which special education departments have large budgets, so supplemental curriculum could be used to fund a project like this. In Pennsylvania, what we're excited about at KDC, Governor Wolf, a Democrat, who is absolutely just an amazing friend to co-ops and also agriculture, in his $24 million farm bill that he just announced, he actually included appropriated funds for rural and urban agriculture education. And they're looking towards KDC to actually be a part of helping to develop what that looks like. So we're very excited about interjecting and throwing in the cooperative advantage, of course, and seeing where this goes. We even have some agricultural societies who have donated money just to support a youth education strategy. So essentially, that's what I've been talking about this entire time, was educating young people, the entire supply chain, K to 12, and have it be publicly and privately funded. I spoke with someone who used to run the ag program in Pennsylvania as well, and we talked about how there's been this sliding decrease over time in funding for agricultural studies. But then he also said you have to get the co-ops to actually pay and support it. What he mentioned was there was a dairy farm in Pennsylvania that eventually went through a couple hands and was purchased by Land O'Lakes. By the time Land O'Lakes purchased it, the person did not have a direct connection to the community, and then that's when the program, that was its demise right then and there. So we need to come back to that and really get multiple stakeholders. That way we can build a sustainable program over time. Many possibilities. I talked to one gentleman who runs what they call a community bank in Pennsylvania. He said, I'm from Philadelphia. How do we continue to inspire kids from Philadelphia to get a heart for agriculture and move out to the community and actually be a part of it? And he said, your education idea is great because everyone may not become a farmer. Everyone might not run a grocery co-op. Everyone might not have a mobile slaughterhouse or a cooperative slaughterhouse, which they're trying to build in New Jersey, cooperatively, of course. But everyone will have a greater understanding, foster diversity and understanding in the entire supply chain. And I think that's it.
I'm sure there are plenty of questions. If we go straight to the floor.
One question?
Okay, if not, I'll start then. I think in the UK, teachers would give their right on to have extra supplemental income to buy an additional curriculum. If there wasn't that supplemental income, how would you fund this? What would you sort of come to that be?
If we didn't have supplemental income, well then we would have to fund it just like the programs have been funded in the past, whether the unions, like farmers unions, would support it. In a perfect world, of course, our national associations would support that. And also with individuals, the community, individual donors would then support it.
Like you said, K-12, what age group?
K-12, from America, it's your primaries. Well, primary and secondary. So it's everyone from age 4 or 5 all the way up to 18. That would be appropriated for. And then of course it would be age appropriate. Like the Farmers Union in America, they have an amazing program that's age appropriate. So if we took something like that, I mean, again, you're not reinventing the wheel. You're getting all of these thought leaders and stakeholders in the same room, and you're taking what's already been created, and you're scaling it.
I've actually got a question. One of the things because I do a lot of work with the worker co-ops in the UK, and what was really interesting to me was in the grocery sector in the States, it's not just consumer co-ops. There's actually quite a thriving worker co-op sector, or a mix where the co-ops actually do have quite a lot of workers and customers and members. So I was wondering if you could explain a little bit more about that dynamic, really.
When you mentioned the dynamic between worker cooperatives and...
Yes, and the fact that I think you said there was like 150 co-ops. Is that in just one region? And are they all consumer co-ops, or are they a mix of worker or consumer co-ops?
I focused on actual grocery co-ops, which are member driven, which have, and that's actually a very good question. Some of the ones that actually, on the Co-op 100 list, when you go back and look at them, there are a lot of distributors, a lot of grocery chains, we call them conglomerates, but actual cooperatives with a lot of stores underneath. And and some of the distributors don't necessarily support cooperative. They support either like discount grocery stores or different grocery stores, in different spaces. In terms of the worker cooperatives, I mean, many of them will be like bookstores and grocery stores. Like one in particular is Red Emma's in the city of Baltimore, which is a trans, mainly LGBTQ bookstore and coffee house. So all of their members are either trans, gay, lesbian, bisexual, and they came together and opened this really fabulous bookstore that is absolutely amazing when you go there, right in the heart and city of one of the most poorest areas in Baltimore. And I mean, they've since moved, but there was like a heroin outpatient clinic right up the street. And when I went in there and sat in that coffee house and restaurant, they were like hipsters sitting in there and also folks from the community, and none were bothered by the other. So it's this interesting and eclectic mix. There's also a catering company which wants to convert. So work conversions are actually are starting to happen, or actually been happening. In our region, it's called Mirror Kitchen. Now, primarily these individuals are of African and Middle Eastern descent women, and they have a catering company. And they are looking to actually convert from a traditional sort of S or LLC to an actual cooperative structure. And then what we were talking about when we first landed was Anytime Taxi, which is a union taxi full of immigrants from Africa and also Pakistan and the Middle East. And what they did was they were getting taken advantage of by traditional cab companies. So they teamed up with Christian Sweeney at the AFL-CIO, which is one of the largest unions in the States. They formed a union, changed the laws, and then launched the taxi. Originally, they thought they would service rural America, but what they're doing is they're serving all of sort of the metropolitan, well, Montgomery County region, and all of their cabs are these lime green in color, but they all are wheelchair accessible. So the senior citizens can get to them, and it's completely owned by the workers. I know that's not food, but I'm just giving you examples of the diversity that does exist in that ecosystem, in our ecosystem.
Sally, I think you've got a question.
Sally Chicken Co-op. I'm very conscious of the huge geographical distances you're talking about. Do you find that people understand what a cooperative is, what they're actually joining as a member? Do they understand up front the values and principles, or is that part of the education process?
Well, KDC, now that we've switched from back to what they call a 501c3 organization and not doing really any political activity, we have 3 areas of business, which is education, cooperative development, and advocacy. But advocacy through partnering with like NCBA CUSA, for example. Interesting questions since we've launched the membership program. So I've been was at the Pennsylvania Sustainable Agricultural Conference, and my first question was, do you belong to a co-op? No. I said, well, do you belong to a credit union? Oh yeah. I said, that's a co-op. They're like, really? Well, I guess I do belong to a co-op. And then they start going down the list of co-ops that they absolutely belong to. So there is absolutely, I think Doug mentioned, as I heard, and I've heard him speak multiple times as being on his team, that education and awareness is number one, and is key to making sure this movement continues to grow. Another interesting question is within the African American community, which has a long history of co-ops in the civil rights movement. When you talk to them about co-ops now, as there's one member that just joined from the Newark, New Jersey area, which is just outside of New York, they want to start a housing co-op, for example. Interestingly enough, he comes out of the credit union space and he starts talking to this group of African Americans about, well, let's form a cooperative. Oh, that's brilliant. So the history is lost in so many ways. So it's education about the history, education about the cooperative advantage, education about the impact that co-ops actually have in creating jobs, like a living wage for individuals, that may not necessarily have gained a good job. So it's that kind of education that's necessary, and you bring a very good point to the table.
Have we got time for one more question? We don't know. All right. Thank you so much, Stephen.